Mr. Speaker, we've just heard media reports of a terrorist attack, an explosion at the Niagara crossing of the Canada-U.S. border. At least two people are dead. One is injured. It is the principal responsibility of government to protect the people. Can the Prime Minister give us an update on what he knows and what action plan he will immediately implement to bring home security for our people?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is obviously a very serious situation in Niagara Falls. There was a vehicle explosion at the Rainbow Bridge crossing. I've been briefed by the NSIA and the Minister of Public Safety. CBSA, RCMP, and Transport Canada are all fully engaged in providing the necessary support. There are a lot of questions, and we are following up to try and get as many answers as rapidly as possible. We are in close contact with U.S. officials, and we'll continue to work closely with them. We will continue to be engaged. We will provide updates. Updates I can give right now is there are 4 border crossings that are right now closed: Rainbow Bridge, Whirlpool Bridge, Queenston Bridge, and Peace Bridge. Additional measures are being contemplated and activated at all border crossings across the country. We are taking this extraordinarily seriously, and Mr. Speaker, I will have to excuse myself now to go get further updates and work on this very serious situation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Leader of the Opposition.
What's up? Rent's up. Rates are up. Taxes up. Debt up. Time's up for this government, Mr. Speaker. After 8 years, they're not worth the cost. And now this Prime Minister cakes on another $20 billion of inflationary spending and will bring up the interest payments on our debt to a record-smashing $51 billion a year. With 2 million Canadians eating at a food bank every month and many facing the loss of their home, why won't they cancel this inflationary scam and replace it with a plan to balance the budget and bring down interest rates and inflation?
Mr. Speaker, yesterday's fall economic statement demonstrates the next phase in our plan to make sure that we have an economy that works for everyone. Mr. Speaker, the International Monetary Fund is predicting that Canada's growth will lead the G7 in 2024. We have the lowest debt-to-GDP ratio in the G7. And Mr. Speaker, while we are building housing, while we are moving on with our clean tax credits, while we are making sure that adoptive parents can have the benefits that they need, you know what's up, Mr. Speaker? The end of support for the Conservative Party for Ukrainians in this country and in Ukraine as the Conservatives vote against the Canada-Ukraine free trade deal. Shame on them!
Actually, what's up is the Prime Minister has once again betrayed Ukraine. He betrayed Ukraine when he gave Putin that big turbine to pump his gas and fund his war. He betrayed Ukraine when he refused to sell Canadian gas to break European dependence on Putin. He betrayed Ukraine by failing to vet someone celebrated in this House who turned out to be a Nazi. And he's betraying Ukraine with this terrible agreement to force a carbon tax on Ukrainians that will destroy their ability to fight a war and rebuild their economy. We will axe the tax and stand unequivocally with Ukrainians in their fight for freedom.
I'll ask the member from St. Albert, Edmonton, to please restrain himself. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if that were true, the members of the opposition would have voted in favour of the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, an agreement that I will note the government of Ukraine asked Canada to do with them in a time of their utmost need when they're facing an illegal war of aggression from Russia. Russia. But instead of supporting Ukrainians in their time of need, instead of truly stand up for their fight for freedom, they vote against it on a red herring. Mr. Speaker, Canadians need to ask what the Conservatives are doing, and there's only one party that's betrayed Ukraine, and that's the Conservatives. Thank you.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, as the Prime Minister was doubling our national debt, adding more debt than all previous 22 Prime Ministers combined, he claimed there'd be no cost because interest rates, he said, were low. But those low interest rates are gone and the debt is still here. Yesterday, we learned that interest on the debt has gone up by over 100%. To $52.4 billion. That's more than the $52.1 billion we spend on healthcare and double what we spend on the military. So why is the Prime Minister taking money from nurses and soldiers and giving it to bankers and bondholders?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday we tabled the fall economic update, which shows the solid foundations of our fiscal frame and also shows that we were able to maintain that fiscal responsibility while being compassionate and being there for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. We're building more homes and we're building them faster. We're changing competition laws in order to stabilize prices in this country. And Mr. Speaker, what the Conservatives are proposing are cuts, is austerity. Right. They want to claw back the supports to families, claw back supports to our seniors, Mr. Speaker. That is not what Canadians need, and that is not what Canadians deserve.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Fear and falsehoods are the only thing they can use to distract from their disastrous record. Mr. Speaker, they are the ones clawing back from seniors and from families with their quadrupling of the carbon tax. For the first time in Canadian history, we have 7 million people who are skipping meals because they can't afford to eat, and 2 million people, a record-smashing number, are now eating at food banks. There is a common-sense solution, which is the Conservative Bill C-234 to take taxes off the farmers who feed us. Will the Prime Minister back down again, stop fighting this common sense bill, and stop taxing our farmers so that our people can afford to eat?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are the government that decided that the retirement age should go back to 65, not 67, which was a decision that side of the House decided to make while their leader was in Davos, Switzerland. But let's stay in Europe for 1 second, Mr. Speaker, and talk about the appalling decision by these so-called Conservatives to turn down a free trade agreement with a beacon of democracy like Ukraine. What is up with that party? That's what Canadians want to know. And this carbon tax excuse, no one's buying.
I am sick and tired of people talking about the cold winter and what we're doing.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the pathological obsession these Liberals have with carbon taxes has now reached a level where it is sick. This is how sick they are on the carbon tax, that they would use Ukraine's vulnerability in the middle of the war to impose their destructive carbon tax on the people of Ukraine and make it harder for them to rebuild after the war. We already know this Prime Minister was used as a Russian propaganda tool when he brought a Nazi into the House of Commons. Why is he trying to damage the Ukrainian economy with a destructive carbon tax in this terrible deal?
The Honourable Minister for International Trade.
The only ones who are not supporting Ukraine are the Conservatives. Let's be clear. The Canada-Ukraine free trade deal does not impose a price on pollution on Ukraine. And you know why? Because Ukraine already has a price on pollution.
I bet you knew that already, right, James?
We're here to support them because the Conservatives are not.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, if it was already there, they wouldn't have needed to put it in the deal. We negotiated the free trade deal with Ukraine. We support free trade with Ukraine. We're the only party that supports a real trade agreement with Ukraine that would include supplying it with Canadian-made defense equipment, which they voted against yesterday. They voted against that yesterday. They voted against supplying Ukraine with clean Canadian energy that would repower their economy. So let's get this straight. They're against selling Canadian munitions to fight the Russian attackers, but they're in favor of imposing a carbon tax on Ukrainians. That's nuts, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister for The Honourable Minister for International Development.
Mr. Speaker, it was bad enough that this party is the only party in this House that doesn't believe in climate change, that doesn't believe in fighting the good fight against climate change. But on top of that now, when Ukrainians are dying literally on behalf of freedom-loving people of the world, they're fighting fascism, they're fighting totalitarianism, they're fighting against an illegal invasion. At that critical moment, what did they choose to do? They chose to abandon Ukrainians in their hour of need. Mr. President, Canadians will remember this moment, and we will never forget this shameful party.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it really is a pathological obsession for a party not only to look at its starving people, the 2 million people in Canada that have to go to food banks every month, the 7 million people who are hungry in Canada, but then to say that the misery from their carbon tax is not enough here in Canada, that they need to export it by imposing it in a pre-existing trade agreement. Mr. Speaker, when I'm Prime Minister, we will have a real free trade agreement with Ukraine that helps them win and rebuild, but has no carbon tax. We will axe the tax here and make sure anyone in the world who wants to axe the tax has the freedom to do it.
The Honourable Minister. Colleagues. I know it is Wednesday. I know that we've all come from our caucuses. I need to ask members to please exercise self-restraint so that the Speaker can hear the question and hear the answers. The Honourable Minister for Justice and Attorney General for Canada.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday when the vote was happening on the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, I was actually sitting with the Ambassador of Ukraine and Ukraine's Prosecutor General. We were talking about the pressing needs of the Ukrainian people and how we address those pressing needs and address their concerns in their hour of need. For the past 18 months, I was pleased to say that we had a multi-partisan approach to addressing Ukraine. Unfortunately, that evaporated in a puff of smoke with a very decided and methodical vote taken on the behalf of the Conservatives. When we say on the side that we stand with Ukraine, we mean it. And when we say Slava Ukraini, we mean it even more.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Our food banks, that if you put the images in black and white, you would just assume you were looking at images from the Great Depression. We have never seen 2 million people going to a food bank in a month. Never had 7 million people eating less than is healthy. But that is the starvation that we have as a result of 8 years of this Prime Minister. There's a common sense Conservative bill, C-234, that is passed to the Senate. The Prime Minister's ministers are are panicking and begging senators to block it. Will the Prime Minister tell his senators that they have go-ahead to pass this common-sense Conservative bill so our farmers can feed our people?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You'd think after 2 decades in this place, the member opposite might know that the Senate is independent of this place. However, there was a time when Canadians could look to Conservatives for a little bit of leadership on fighting climate change. Mr. Speaker, Brian Mulroney was a...
Colleagues, please. I had trouble hearing the honourable member, so I'm going to ask the honourable member to start again from the top so that I can hear. Please, honourable members.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, you'd think after 2 decades working here, and no other job before that, I might add, that the member opposite, leader of the Conservative Party, would know that the Senate is independent of this place. And you know, there was also a time, Mr. Speaker, when Canadians could look to the Conservatives for a little bit of leadership on climate action, back when Brian Mulroney led the fight against climate change, and when my neighbour, the member from Wellington Halton Hills, staked his entire leadership campaign on a carbon price. Now the leader of the Conservative Party is using climate action as a wedge to justify their vote, shameful vote, against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. Mr. Speaker, Ukraine already prices carbon, and they're out of air.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the member's comedy routine won't make up for the fact that Canadians cannot afford to feed themselves. But the Prime Minister is in a bind again. He was already bullied by his Atlantic caucus into panicking and bringing in a temporary pause on home heating taxes, but only for some. Now, his Environment Minister is threatening to resign if there are any more carbon tax carve-outs. Will the Prime Minister stop allowing himself to be bullied and threatened by his radical Environment Minister and axe the tax on our farmers so that Canadians can afford to eat?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The only thing radical in this House is the leader of the Conservatives Party constant climate denial, Mr. Speaker. As I just mentioned, the Conservatives are trying to use climate denial in an attempt to justify their shameful vote against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement yesterday. But I have news for the Conservatives. Ukraine already prices carbon, along with other European countries like Norway, Sweden, Great Britain, Denmark, Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, Poland, Switzerland. A lot of them believe in pricing carbon, Mr. Speaker. They all ran on that promise, and the member from Wellington Halton Hills staked his entire leadership campaign on it, Mr. Speaker. Get with the program, Conservatives.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Their program is hunger and homelessness for Canadians. Fortunately, we have a common-sense Conservative solution which would take the carbon tax off of our farmers. The tax they want to quadruple. But the Prime Minister is in a panic because his Environment Minister says, and I quote, "As long as I am the Environment Minister, there will be no more exemptions to the carbon pricing," end quote. In other words, if this bill passes, his Minister of Environment will resign. Why won't the Prime Minister simply accept the Minister's resignation now and let this bill pass so Canadians can feed themselves?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians know what it means when they hear the words common sense Conservatives. It means cuts to the programs and the services that they rely on that ultimately hurt Canadians. But let's put some facts on the table, Mr. Speaker. Since we've come into office in 2015, we've lifted 650,000 children, 2.7 million Canadians out of poverty. Canada now ranks 6th in terms of where we rank in terms of child poverty in the world. When the Conservatives were in office, when that leader was in office, Mr. Speaker, Canada ranked 24th in the world when it came to child poverty. Mr. Speaker, we continue to support Canadians. We'll stay on the facts, and we will not cut services like the Conservatives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
No, what they're doing is cutting the food budgets of families by raising the tax on the farmers who feed us. Again, there is a common sense Conservative bill that passed through this House of Commons against the great protest of the Prime Minister, who still wants to quadruple the tax. We're simply asking him to tell his Environment Minister to resign and let his Liberal-appointed ministers pass the bill. So, what will he pick? Will he pick allowing Canadians to feed their families around the kitchen table, or will he keep his crazy Environment Minister around the cabinet table?
I'd like to remind all members that it's important to use language which is, when it's directed at a particular member, language that is not disruptive or demeaning. I will ask the Honourable Minister to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll happily tell the Leader of the Opposition what we pick on this side. Mr. Speaker, we pick to support Canadians in their time of need. Mr. Speaker, we pick to fight climate change, Mr. Speaker, which we know is an existential threat. And we pick to ensure that we are supporting people who are seeking their freedom around the world, Mr. Speaker. What we're seeing in the United States is right-wing politicians who are turning away from Ukraine, turning towards Russia. I can only assume that's what we're seeing here in Canada right now, as the members opposite are the only ones in Canada who are not standing with Ukraine. Canadian stands with Ukraine, and everyone else except for the Conservative Party does.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
It's come to light that the Prime Minister will spend $15 billion tax dollars, that's $1,000 for every single family in Canada, on a grant that will pay for 1,600 replacement workers to come in and displace union jobs in Windsor in a battery plant there, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Prime Minister is desperately claiming that he had no choice in the matter. Well, then why doesn't he open up the contract so all Canadians can see if there were any guarantees that this massive $15 billion grant would actually lead to Canadian and not foreign paychecks?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is a little bit rich coming from a political party that not only doesn't stand for auto workers, doesn't stand for Canadian workers at all, has no interest in a green economic plan like we have. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have not been with workers. They've not been with the auto sector. We are building battery plants in parts of this country. We are building a green economic plan. Mr. Speaker, let's look at the facts. 1, temporary foreign worker permit has been approved. 1.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, and there are 1,599 more, at least, in foreign replacement workers who will be coming to use the $15 billion tax dollars that this Prime Minister is making Canadians pay for this single plan. In fact, here I have the advertisements for the position: electric quality mode engineer, skills required, bilingual in English or Korean. Wow. Mr. Speaker, this is true of countless of the job applications. Will the Prime Minister release the contract on this $15 billion deal to see if any of the money is going to go to Canadian workers, or it's all going to foreign replacement workers?
The Honourable Minister for Employment and Workforce Development.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the official opposition's misinformation cannot hide the transformational nature of this investment and investments like it across the country. Let's be extremely clear and focused on the facts, Mr. Speaker. 2,500 permanent jobs in the Windsor area to operate this plant, 2,300 Canadian jobs to construct this plant. Those are the facts. He's risky, he's reckless, and he's just dealing in pure misinformation.
Again, I'd like to remind members to use language which doesn't impugn the member's use of information. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my information comes from the Windsor Police, who had a visit from the South Korean ambassador to set up the arrival of 1,600 South Korean replacement workers who will displace union workers in Windsor. Unions are up in arms as this government is displacing their workers to bring in replacement workers from abroad. So if anything I am saying is wrong, why doesn't the government just announce that they will release the contract to show any guarantees there are that the jobs will go to Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Employment and Workforce Development.
Mr. Speaker, let's look at the facts and let's look at an authority in this matter, Mr. Speaker. Dave Cassidy, president of Union Local 444, calling out the disinformation from the Conservative Party as absolutely false and baseless. Mr. Speaker, there is simply no justification for what the ambassador of South Korea has suggested. 2,500 Canadian jobs to operate this plant, 2,300 Canadian jobs to construct this plant. Those are the facts. Those are the investments we're building for the future. Everything else is just risk and recklessness from the Conservatives.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
What is risky and reckless is to spend $15 billion, which works out to $1,000 for every family in Canada, for a project that will employ foreign replacement workers. Those workers will displace our union jobs in this country. In other words, our money for foreign workers. This is according to the police from Windsor, the local Windsor municipal government. These are the facts. And if the Prime Minister has any other facts he'd like to share, why won't he just give us the contract?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, let's get real. These Conservatives have never been for workers. They don't understand that the fight against climate change creates prosperity for generations to come. These once-in-a-generation investments in the Next Star facility is bringing 2,500 permanent jobs to Windsor, which is bringing back the auto industry. I don't know how you can spin this negatively. But it's beyond me that the Conservatives can somehow spin this negatively.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister had a chance yesterday to cancel his plan to quadruple the carbon tax. It's important to understand how much he wants to raise taxes on Canadians. He wants to raise it up to 61 cents a litre. That will raise the cost of heat, gas, but also food, because when you tax the farmers who make the food and the truckers who ship the food, you tax all who buy the food. So will the Prime Minister finally tell us how much will it cost the average family when he quadruples the tax? And will he call an election on the carbon tax in order that Canadians can decide for themselves?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, the agri-food sector is affected probably more than any other sector by climate change. In a year when we saw increased floods and more frequent storms, when we saw soil erosion and sporadic and unpredictable rainfall, when we saw fires that went across this country, devastating rural communities, driving people out of their homes and causing destruction, it's really disappointing that the Conservatives still don't believe in climate change. All of those impacts result from climate change, and a price on pollution is working to reduce our emissions and fight that fight.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Only it's not working. They've missed every emissions target but one in the year that the economy was entirely locked down. This Liberal government ranks 58th out of 63 in the world, and their own Environment Commissioner says they will not meet their emissions targets. Yet they still go ahead with this carbon tax, which has proven not to work. So they want to quadruple the tax, including on farmers who have no other choice than to use traditional hydrocarbons to power their machinery, their barns, and their drying. So once again, how much will the carbon tax cost the average Canadian farmer when the Prime Minister quadruples it?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Conservatives were concerned about the cost of food and the cost of fuel, they would stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, because it is Russia's illegal war of aggression that is driving up global food prices and global fuel prices. But they are ideologically committed to ignoring climate change and doing anything that they could to possibly fight it, so much so that they throw Ukraine under the bus and vote against the very agreement that the Ukrainian government has asked Canada to support. Mr. Speaker, they need to give their head a shake, and they need to stand with the people who are fighting for freedom around this world.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The minister who stood and had a photo taken with a Nazi that helped Russian propaganda all around the world. But the question was about the carbon tax costs on the average Canadian farmer. I have here the power bill from Enbridge for a farm in my riding that is $11,000 in carbon taxes alone. That's today. Now the Prime Minister wants to quadruple the tax on Canadian farmers, which will drive up the cost of production, drive food growth out of this country, and drive prices up for everyday Canadian families. So once again, how much will the average farmer pay in carbon taxes once this Prime Minister implements his plan to quadruple the tax?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, what is unbelievable is that for the Leader of the Opposition, who claims to stand for freedom, who claims to stand for democracy, will do everything he can to ideologically oppose fighting climate change, including not standing with Ukrainians who are facing an illegal war of aggression by Russia, Mr. Speaker. That is driving up food and fuel prices around the world. If he truly cared about supporting Canadian families, Canadian farmers, he would support the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and he wouldn't abandon them in their time of need.
Their idea of helping farmers is putting in an $11,000 tax on one farm for 1 month. One farm, 1 month, $11,000. Now, they want to quadruple the tax on Canada's farmers. That will do nothing except for send the food production to more polluting foreign countries and forcing us to burn more diesel to transport it all the way back to Canada. So why don't they bring home food production and axe the tax on farmers?
The Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Mr. Speaker, number one, we have a climate plan, and we will continue to deal with the climate plan. If we do not deal with climate, we increasingly put up the price of food. We have invested in farmers right across this country. We're going to make sure that farmers and ranchers stay on the cutting edge. We deal with climate change, because if we do not deal with climate change, like every country in the world is, we will continue to raise prices in the world.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, they still don't have a plan to fight climate change over there. What they have is a plan to quadruple a tax that has failed to fight climate change, giving Canada the 58th ranking out of 63 countries, missing every target but one in 8 years, and on track to miss their targets in 2030. So stop distracting from the real agenda here, which is to take money away from farmers, from food, and from the necessities of Canadian life. Will they, yes or no, announce their support for the Senate passing common sense Conservative Bill C-234 to take the tax off the farmers who feed us?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know who knows a thing or two about farming and climate change? That's the farmers who work in the breadbasket of the world, Ukrainian farmers. And you know who asked Canadian parliamentarians to vote for the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement? Ukrainian farmers. So did the Ukrainian-Canada Congress. So did President Zelensky himself. Ukrainian farmers are betrayed by this federal government. That's the people who grow.
members who are rising on a point of order. The honourable minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And during question period, I heard in one of the questions from the Leader of the Opposition his reckless use of the word crazy as a pejorative for one of our cabinet ministers. Mr. Speaker, the